Okay, we'll get started in just a moment here. Good afternoon and welcome to today's lunch break with the Rabbi. Hope you're all doing well on this wonderful Monday, November 16th, the 29th of Kislev. 29th of Cheshvan, which is the eve of Rosh Chodesh Kislev. Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the new month of Kislev, which we'll discuss tomorrow, of course. Today we're going to start with today's Torah reading, which is the Torah reading of Toldos, which literally means children. What does this mean to us, and how do we look at these children that we talk about in this week's Torah reading? In today's Torah reading, we read about the first episode of Isaac and Rebekah's life, where Isaac and Rebekah, after getting married for 20 years, were still barren. They did not have any children. And Isaac and Rebekah go to pray to God that they should have children. And eventually she becomes pregnant, and she feels that she's pregnant, and every single time she goes by a synagogue, she feels like the child is kicking and wants to come out, and every single time she goes by a place of idolatry, the child also wants to come out. And she thinks, what's going on over here with my child? It sounds confused. And she says, what do I need this for, a confused child? So she goes to Shem, who was the prophet at the time, and says, what's going on over here? And he explains to her that she has twins. One is going to be a scholar, one's going to be a hunter and idolater. And lo and behold, we find that Yaakov and Esav grow up. Yaakov becomes the scholar, Esav becomes the hunter, and that's the way this week's Torah reading begins. Looking at Esav, looking at his character, at who he was, and the things that he did. He was a hunter. He killed people. Not only that, he was far from an observant Jew. He was the counter opposite of whatever Jacob was. He was the opposite of what his parents educated them to be. And at 13 years old, this child was already going on wayward ways. Where was his education? Where are the parents of such great sainthood? Haven't they given anything to their child? Didn't they educate their child with something? How does he go off the beaten path? When we look at education, we look at children. Is it fair to judge parents by their children's behavior? Is it fair to say, look at this child, what an imbecile, what a mess. Where were his parents? Why didn't they educate him? Look what became of him. On the contrary, you see a child who excels, who becomes a Nobel Prize winner of academics, becomes a doctor, a lawyer, or a rabbi, for whatever profession you want to say. Do we give credit to their parents? And we say how lucky they are. Look what kind of education they have given their child. They must have been wonderful parents. Or sometimes you can see, as we find in our this week's Torah reading, in the same family, one becomes a great scholar, the patriarch of the Jewish people, and one becomes his nemesis, a hunter, a destroyer, a killer. How does it work out? Where do we put the responsibility? But if we look a little bit in the Torah, we can see that sometimes the Torah attributes good behaviors to the parents and negative behaviors to the parents. And it seems like the Torah puts responsibility on the parents due to their children's behavior. And we know the great debate, whether it's nature versus nurture. But at the end of the day, we know the parents play a big role in the children's education. The Torah talks about, the Talmud extols the greatness of a great scholar of Yeshua. Ashrei Yoladata, lucky is the one who gave birth to him. Because of the education that they've invested in this child, he became to become this great prodigy and this great scholar. At the same time, the Talmud tells us a story about a woman by the name of Miriam Bas Bilgo. She married a Roman emperor and desecrated the Holy Temple, and because of that, her family was punished in the Holy Temple, that family of Kohanim. And the Talmud asks why. It's only one child. What is the family responsible? And the Talmud responds because a child says what happens in their parents' home. When you see a child say vulgar anti-Semitism or whatever it may be, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. They learned it from someplace. And when a child behaves respectively and speaks kindly, they also didn't learn it in a vacuum. They learned it from someplace. Education carries a lot of weight, but to what extent? Over here we learn in this week's Torah reading, Yitzchak and Rivka, the greatest of all people, Isaac and Rebekah, the patriarch and the matriarch of Jewish people. Isaac was considered an oila tamima, an holy sacrifice, the holy of holy. And still and all, he has a child like Esau. How is that possible? Let's contrast this to a little bit. To Yishmael. Abraham had a son who also wasn't the most well-behaved. But the difference is, Yishmael, the Talmud explains, was born to a non-Jewish mother. He wasn't considered even Jewish. Esau, on the other hand, was born to Rebekah, the righteous of the righteous, who arose amongst the thorns. How is it that she would give birth to a child of such evil? But let's go a step further. Do you recall the medrash that I began with? That when Rebekah walked by a place of idolatry, she felt the child kicking. The child, even before he was even had a chance to be educated, he was already prone to idolatry, leaving the child seemingly with no choice. Where was the choice given for this child to be able to have any chance in life? Though the Talmud and the Torah tells us that it was only when he reached age 13 that he discovered this mean streak, so to speak, that he had within him, that he became a hunter. In fact, the Torah begins this week's Torah reading as he walks in famished and he deals with his brother to be able to get some lentil soup, because that was the first time he actually killed somebody. He was regretting it. He felt sorry. He felt he was going to die. He wasn't worthy of anything. So did he care or didn't he care? What kind of individual is this fellow Esau? And the commentaries and the esoteric and the mystical way of looking at it tell us the unique character of Esau can be determined by the end of his life. At the end of the life of Esau, as we go to the end of the book of Genesis, we learn about the passing of Jacob. And when Jacob passes away, they're about to bury him in the cave of the patriarchs, and all of a sudden Esau came and said, "Stop. Bring me the document that he got it. It's my plot. Jacob buried Leah there. I get the other part." But they said, "Didn't you sell it to him in this week's Torah reading?" Meanwhile, Dun's son, who was deaf and didn't know what was going on, saw there was somebody blocking his grandfather from being buried, took a stick and bashed him over the head, and his head went flying into the cave of the patriarchs while his body of Esau was buried someplace else. The Talmud tells us this is not by chance. And the esoteric, the mystics explain that the head of Esau was always in the good place, and therefore it was buried in the cave of the patriarchs. But his body was not. And this is the way the mystics view this episode of Esau. Esau is not a bad guy, the mystics explained. In fact, he was just as great as Jacob, maybe even greater. Jacob was born with an innate talent and an innate quality to gravitate towards holiness. Esau, on the other hand's job was to transform the impurity into holiness. And therefore, he gravitated towards materialism, into the impurity, into the idolatry, because he was on a higher level to be able to transform it. The problem is, he didn't stand up to his task. In fact, we find that Isaac found favor in Esau more than Jacob. Isaac was able to say Yitzchak saw the greatness of Esau. And therefore he loved him more, as the Torah tells us, because he saw within him a potential that can be revealed. In fact, if you look in the first part of this week's Torah reading, the first verse, it says, "These are the children of Isaac." Isaac was born to Avram. Isaac is the son of Avram. And the commentators ask, Isaac was born to Avram, then he was the son of Avram. Why is it repetitious? And the commentators explain because God made Isaac look exactly like Abraham. Because people were saying, hey, how can Abraham give birth to a child so late? It was probably born from somebody else. But why does it tell it us when Isaac is only 60 years old? It's because when Esau was born, people started saying, how can such a child come from Abraham? Such an evildoer, such an idolatrous individual. If Isaac is so holy, Rebecca is so holy, where does this kid come from? Whose child is he? With this, the Talmud tells us. The mystic explain, because Esau came from such a great level, a level that's beyond rationale. And his job was to transform, to convert, to make material spiritual. Unfortunately, he wasn't up to task. Unfortunately, he didn't utilize that opportunity. But potentially, he was given a greater quality than even Jacob. Jacob, as the first Chabad Rebbe explains in Tanya, is when you eat, there's two types of dishes. You have a dish that's sweet and tasty, but then you have a dish that's sharp and spicy. The one that's sweet and tasty to the palate, everybody enjoys. But the one that's spicy, you have to have a distinguished palate to be able to understand and appreciate and develop the taste for that spicy and exotic food. Jacob was that sweet food. He was that beautiful child, didn't do anything wrong, a pleasure to be around. Esau was that child with the greatest potential, but you have to be able to appreciate it. You have to develop a taste for it. And unfortunately, not all of us develop that taste for the spiciness and for that type of character. But the Torah is telling us even a deeper message, not just the story of the past about Jacob and Esau, but about every single one of us in our day-to-day life. Of course, it's easy to have the easy child and be that just automatically gravitate to holiness and do the right thing all the time. But then you see that child, whether it's the child within yourself or the child in front of you, that's rambunctious, giving you a hard time. And you say, oh my, whose fault is this? Why is he giving me this hard time? Why do I have to deal with this? What God is telling you, that when you're faced with a challenge, whether it's your child or child within you that's gravitating to things which are not holy, remember, you're able to transform it. You can change it. And that's even a greater level than just starting out on the right path. Sometimes you have to see the dark, you see the light hidden behind the darkness, see the good beneath the bad. And to be able to uncover it, you come to a greater good, a greater ideal, and a better appreciation for what this is good. Imagine a child with special needs. You never imagined they'd be able to reach certain heights, but all of a sudden they do. The ecstatic pleasure and greatness and nachas that you have, even more than a regular child that's performing. That's because you thought they wouldn't be able to. On the outside, they didn't look like your average. So too is the evil inclination. So too is with our different inklings and desires. We sometimes feel that we're overcome by evil, overcome by bad, overcome by temptation. The Mishnah tells us who is strong, one that can overcome his evil temptations. Don't feel diminished. You too are a child of Abraham and Isaac. You too have the opportunity to transform darkness to light, evil to good. You too can make this material world a spiritual oasis for God. You too can always do the right thing. Now go ahead and do it. God bless you. Have a great day. Looking forward to joining you tomorrow again, 1 p.m. Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month of Kislev, a special day. Join us tomorrow and find out more. Also, I would like to remind you, we're back on with our course tomorrow night, 7:30 p.m. We'll be discussing Noah's Ark. Looking forward to celebrating and looking forward to hearing from you tomorrow. God bless you and have a great day.